Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Anderson's Bookshop virtual author event with Reid Forgrave and special guest Wayne Drehs. We're so glad to have you all with us tonight. Please go ahead and leave your video and audio off for the duration of the event, just so we can focus on our speakers. Thank you for taking the time to keep your eyes on yet another screen to talk books with us tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Anderson's Bookshops is an independent bookstore. We have been owned and run by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations now. We'd like to say we've already survived one pandemic in the early 1900s, so we're going to survive this one too, but it will be thanks to your support. And your support and your attendance here is very personal and appreciated by us, so we just like to take a minute to say thank you for all of that. We would normally be having this event in person, along with the 400 some that we do every year, but of course that's not an option right now. So we're hoping that this virtual style keeps us all tied over until we can be together in person again, whenever that may be. We do have other virtual events on our calendar. Just announced today was Cory Doctorow, and sort of a sliding into the week announcements as well is Michael Ian Black, actually, which his new book, A Better Man, about his son and masculinity, which is really great. So we would love for you to check out our website or our social media handles and find your next event or another book that piques your interest. So there's more stuff coming, but keep in touch with us and we'd be happy to get that up to you. But tonight we are very happy to welcome to Anderson's Reid Forgrave and his new book, Love, Zach. Reid writes about sports and other topics for GQ, the New York Times Magazine, and Mother Jones, among other publications. He's covered the NFL and college football for FoxSports.com and CBS Sports, and he currently writes for the Star Tribune in Indianapolis. The article in which he first wrote about Zach Easter is included in Best American Sports Writing 2018. Congrats, Reid, that's great. And a past life found him working at the Des Moines Register in Iowa, where he wrote long-form narrative journalism and covered the state's first-in-the-nation presidential caucuses. And our moderator tonight is Wayne Drehs, who is a senior feature writer for ESPN Digital and Print Media, and a 3-time Emmy Award winner, as he is kindly displayed on his shelves behind him so that we can all join that. But Reid and Wayne, thank you so much. Welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. We're glad to have you guys.
Yeah, this is awesome to be here, and I'm very glad to be joined by noted Iowa Hawkeye, Wayne Drehs, who's very this book is set in Iowa, and it's almost like a character, frankly, of this book. So Wayne knows Iowa intimately, and again, thank you to Anderson's for doing this. What a cool bookstore! I love independent bookstores. There's nothing better. One of the sad things about COVID is, I haven't been to many bookstores recently, and I can't wait until things are normal again.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I'm just going to tell everybody, if you've got questions for these guys as we go along, please throw them in the chat and we'll get to them later. But I'm going to pop off video and let you guys chat. So have at it.
Awesome.
Thanks
so much, Jenny. Everybody, it is more than an honor to be here today and kind of drive this train with Reid. Reid is a phenomenal talent, and I've been a long-time fan of his. In the sports writing world, you have people that you follow and you love their work, and you cross paths with in a press box, and you become a fan. And Reid is one of those gentlemen. And Love, Zach is incredible. I, in my 20 years at ESPN, have done stories about CTE and athletes who have had issues with mental health, and even a football player who had committed suicide, a story sort of similar to this. And Reid has taken those pieces and taken that narrative, I believe, to the next level. And he's not paying me to say that, nor are the folks at Anderson's. It's just really, really good work. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to kick this off. Reid's going to speak for a few minutes. We're going to talk about the process he went through to put this all together. I think he'll do a reading for us, and then at the end, we'll get to some of your questions. You can put those in the chat at any time, and we're also going to talk big picture and what Love, Zach, and what the issue of CTE and concussions means for football and for sports moving forward. So, Reid, I'll kick it off to you. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, we are definitely in a mutual admiration society, and not just because of your completely dope sneaker collection over your right shoulder. But Wayne is just one of the best there is, especially in telling those human stories. I think we're sort of kindred spirits in this way. But yeah, my name's Reid Forgrave. I'm a writer based out of Minneapolis. Moved up here 5 years ago from Des Moines, Iowa. This is my book. Thank you guys so much for supporting this book. I'd like to start just by telling you a little bit about Zach. Zach Easter is the title character of my book, and I wrote a 288-page book about a young man that I never met. The first time I ever heard the name Zach Easter was actually in his obituary. It was a couple days before Christmas of 2015. I was back home in Pittsburgh, where I'm originally from, visiting my family for the holidays. Big football town. I kind of grew up in that football milieu. And when I was back home for the holidays, I got an email from an old friend, and he had seen Zach's obituary in the Des Moines Register, a newspaper where I worked for 6 years. And he told me, boy, you got to check this out. An obituary for a 24-year-old man. I don't need to tell you this. It's always heartbreaking. But Zach's was just even more so. It was juxtaposed with his photograph, with his huge, enormous smile. And all throughout this obituary were details that indicated this incredibly bright future that should have been ahead for him. He just graduated from college with a 4.0 GPA. He was this decorated soldier in the Iowa National Guard. In fact, he had just won Iowa Soldier of the Year. He talked about how he was just this huge fan of the Green Bay Packers. He was just incredibly proud of this 10-point buck that he nabbed with his father and his brothers back in his senior year of high school. But Zach, he couldn't see all that potential that everyone else could see. All he saw was this future where the brain disease that he blamed on playing football only through high school, would slowly destroy him. And 6 days before Christmas, Zach committed suicide. And it was the final paragraph of this obituary that made me realize I had to find out more about this tragic tale of Zach Easter. And I'm going to read this paragraph to you, because this was really my jumping off point into this incredibly sad, but I think incredibly important story. Zach was a selfless person. This is what the obituary read. His last wish was to make sure that no one else has to struggle from head trauma like he did. It is important to Zach to tell his story about CTE, a disease he attempted to manage for years. He suffered from severe migraines, brain tremors, slurred speech, blurred vision, and dementia, among other physical ailments. He unselfishly is donating his brain along with a detailed diary that documented his life so that no one suffers the way that he did. He bravely fought this silent disease for years until he was no longer able. His spirit will always be with us. Zach asked that memorials be donated to the Concussion Legacy Foundation so that further research can be done on this disease. His final request is that people talk about CTE, support more research, and value knowledge. So that's how I found myself on the very first Sunday afternoon of 2016, sitting on the floor of Brenda and Miles Easter's living room in Indianola, Iowa. Mounted on the wall beside me, I could see Zach's prized 10-point buck. And on the television behind me was a football game between Zach's Green Bay Packers and his father's favorite team, the Minnesota Vikings. You can probably guess who won there. It had been 2 weeks since their son had taken his own life. In fact, taken his father's 20-gauge shotgun and shot himself in the chest. In the chest because he wanted his brain to go to science. And the Easters, they live out in the timber and the cornfields, this beautiful piece of land outside this small town of Indianola. And their family history in this part of the country is just so tied to this land. It dates back to before the Civil War. Zach is a seventh-generation Iowan. And that's a vital part of the man that he was, Zach Easter, because he had this traditional version of masculinity. And to me, that became quickly apparent as I was spending hours speaking with Zach's mother and his father and his girlfriend and one of his brothers, talking about how his decade of playing football recklessly, third grade through senior year of high school, had led to so many concussions and eventually to his death. All the men in this living room, myself included, we're turning around our shoulders, we're sneaking glances at the NFL game, and we're pulling out our cell phones, we're peeking at our fantasy football leagues. I've spent a big chunk of my career examining human suffering, and I deeply believe that great meaning about the human condition can be derived from those lessons that we all learn from tragedy. I'm really comfortable with steering into the pain. It's a bizarre thing to be good at, but it's something I'm good at. And I remember from that very first afternoon when I met the Easter family, I knew there was something different with them, something special, something vital about his story. And the first reason was that Zach had left behind these journals, reams of journals that documented his demise. The family courageously gave those journals to me. And it was remarkable in reading these journals, watching in real time his mood swings, his ups and downs, his confusion, the just completely unpredictable and frankly self-destructive behavior that came with this disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the brain disease that's become associated with athletes in lots of contact sports, but especially in football. You in Chicago know all about this. Dave Duerson was one of the sort of original suicides that really brought attention to this. But beyond Zach's personal tragedy, I think what makes this story such a vital tale about today's America is what Zach represents. It's a book about sports, but this is not a sports book. It's a book about like what it means to be a man in 21st century America. It's a book about parenting. I spent so much time looking at my 4-year-old son, who you may have seen him pop in just at the beginning of the speech, and my 8-year-old son, and thinking about how I'm raising them to be a man in an age where our definitions of manhood are very much changing. It's a book about what fathers pass on to their sons. It's a book about that like sort of very blurry line between traditional masculinity and what a lot of people now call toxic masculinity. It's a book about as a country, and frankly as humans, just our addiction to violence, not just in our sports, but in our everyday lives, just part of who we are as humans. Honestly, not to get too high-minded, but I think it's a book about what we value as a country. But ultimately, I hope when people read this book, I hope this is a book that honors Zach's dying wish to bring to the forefront his very deep concerns about the safety of this sport. And it's a sport that he and his family still, to this day, still deeply, deeply love. I'm going to end this part of our evening with the final words that Zach left behind in this 39-page typewritten document. It was a Microsoft Word file, sort of an autobiography of sorts, and he left it in his childhood bedroom before he died by suicide. This is what Zach wrote. Take it with grace and know I love you all. Spread the word of mental illness and concussions, and over time, please spread my story. Great things can happen from this event. Think of all the lives that can be saved if all of you come together and help people by spreading the word. Thanks again for coming out. I can talk about this book for hours, but I promise we'll keep it to about an hour. Wayne, I appreciate you coming out, noted Iowa Hawkeye. Thanks for doing this, man.
Yeah, it's awesome. I have so many questions for you that I'm going to have to trim down to like half a list so we can keep it to an hour and let our visitors ask you some questions as well. One of the things that struck me as I read this, as a fellow journalist, you know, Reid, I know what it's like to bury yourself in a story and bury yourself in somebody's life to the point where you can sometimes forget the path that you're on in your own life. It consumes you.
Yeah.
And I know, you know, given the level of depth you've gone with this piece, I'm sure that this story and the Easter family and the journey they went on was something that overcame you at points as well. What I'm struck by is this was his last dying wish, to have someone share his story to help others, right? And I'm curious if you've done any reflecting at all on why you think it was you that ended up in that living room being the one to share this young man's story in his last dying wish.
I mean, honestly, so I look at this two ways, sort of just like as a journalist who's out to get the story, but then also just as sort of like the metaphysical way, like meaning of life type stuff.
Yeah, of course.
As a journalist, I think it was vital that I reached out to this family when this thing was raw. I think I sort of became, in a way, part of their story, where it's like, 2 weeks later is when I have this very first conversation with them in their living room for 4 hours. And I was floored by it. And there've been a couple times that I've come out of interviews thinking, oh my gosh, this is a book. This one was like the strongest, where I was like, oh my gosh, this deserves so much more than just a 3,000 word story on foxsports.com where I was working at the time. But so part of it was, I think, getting there early, and I became like, they have their pastor and their family that they're leaning on, and oh, here's this journalist that pops by every once in a while, and I sort of became part of their mourning period. As a sort of the more metaphysical part of it, I really started to believe that this is in a way my calling. We don't go into this type of journalism to make the big bucks or to get famous. We do it because, like, the depth of feeling that writers like you and me, and I think we're kind of black sheep sometimes in journalism, but we want to tell those very human stories that, dig deep into suffering. And I've spent so much of my career telling these stories about, the mother in Des Moines, Iowa, when I was working for a newspaper, who had 2 of her grown sons commit suicide, doing things like knocking on the door of the parents of the firefighter from rural Washington State 12 hours after their son died in a forest fire, and being the first reporter to get there. I've gotten comfortable with pain, and I've gotten to a point where I think I'm really good at, like, teasing out meaning from it. And you do get involved in this stuff. There are so many interviews. There's a story I'm working on right now for a newspaper here in Minneapolis. And it's one of the stories that's taken months, and it's about COVID and has like a bunch of different characters, sort of like the story of COVID in Minnesota. And there's this one character who's a funeral home director, and he tells me at the end of every like 2-hour-long interview, it's always all by phone. I've never met this guy in person, but he's like, "Thank you. Like, I feel like this was like a therapy session. I really needed this." And I think that there can be some dangers in getting too emotionally involved with people you're writing about. I was terrified what the family would think of this book. I didn't want them to have pre-publication review because I just had to separate that. They did like it, by the way. I think it was very painful for them, but they did like appreciate that Zach's story lives on. But you have to kind of not care about that. At the same time, like, if you're not authentically, in a story like this, involved in someone's life, crying along with them, going to the lake where, 6 months before her boyfriend committed suicide, going to that lake with, first time meeting his girlfriend, and it's her first time being back to that lake. It's a very meaningful place for them. You can't not cry. You can't not, this whole process. I look at Miles Easter, his father, and I'm always like, I look at my sons. I'm like, what if that were me? And to me, he's the most tragic character in this book, probably because I feel that I identify with him so much.
I think, you make an interesting point in that, you want people to trust you. You want people to share. I mean, you're walking into somebody's house, asking them to tell you the deepest, darkest, most awful moment of their life, and every detail they can share. And to do that, you have to bond with people and build that trust. But at the same time, you're not writing one individual story of what happened. You're writing the story of what happened and what it means. And I think, I once heard somebody say to me when I wrote a story, Reid, I hate the story that you wrote, but damn, you nailed it. That's me. I mean, at the end of the day, right? And not that, that's the case here, but I just mean, like, that's what you try to do. And I think,
what you just said, that's like, people who aren't journalists, I'm not sure if they fully understand it, but that's almost like the biggest compliment.
Oh, absolutely. No question.
Right?
Yes, 100%. No, take all the trophies away. That's the number one biggest compliment I've ever had in my career. Absolutely.
Maybe not the Emmys, but the other trophies.
Yeah, right. Something else I want to ask you. Two things. First of all, tell me the story of the first time you reached out to this family. What you were thinking, what you were feeling. Is your heart racing? Like, what was your introduction to them from the beginning?
So I had lived in Iowa, in Des Moines, which is right by Indianola, like 20 miles away. I'd been to Indianola dozens of times in the 10 years I lived in Iowa. Worked for the Des Moines Register for 6 years. I had all sorts of connections in Iowa. And like I said, someone passed on this obituary. I was back home in Pittsburgh, off work for a week or whatever. And I remember reading it. I remember reading that paragraph and being like, I got to track his mother down. For some reason, I think mothers, maybe it's like the sensitive side of me, my feminine side, it's easier to connect with mothers sometimes on a tragic story like this. And I had a handful of contacts in Indianola, and I reached out to all of them. And someone's like, I know Brenda Easter, his mom. She's a fairly prominent person in town. She runs the Chamber of Commerce. Her dad, or her husband, Miles, was the defensive coordinator for the high school football team. People know them. And she called me. It must have been like, I think right after his funeral, but before Christmas. It might have been on Christmas Eve. And she said, come on down and come visit us. And I was nervous. I wasn't thinking, hey, this is going to be a book. It was like, hey, this is an important topic. It hits the zeitgeist for people talking about football and concussions and CTE. It's a worthy story, whether it was going to be a TV story for Fox Sports 1 or just a written piece. But I knew there was clearly something there. From that very first phone call, even before I met him in person, met the family in person, I could tell they were motivated to tell his story. Without Zach's dying wishes, without him leaving behind all these journals, no magazine article would exist. It would just be the mystery of Zach's unfortunate suicide, tragic suicide. But because he left these behind, and left behind very explicit instructions to his parents, don't mourn my death. I'm in a better place. I needed to do this, but you need to spread my story. They, right from the jump, I mean, you could read that in that obituary. Like, hearing that in an obituary is somewhat shocking. And without them, this is sort of the way that they have found meaning in this tragedy. And I think that there's been some therapy, especially for Brenda, his mom. There's been some therapy in going through this process and saying, you know what, Zach's death wasn't completely in vain. It was tragic and it was awful, and she mourns it every single day. But Zach's very explicit that, like, he sees this almost as like a sacrifice to help save other people.
It's interesting. Anytime, I've ever dealt with a family who's lost, a child or a teenager or someone in their 20s to a tragic death, they always want that. They always want something to go on, right? To somehow to have their son or daughter remembered and honored, and have their child not die in vain. And what I think is interesting about this is for anyone who would wrestle with whether or not they want to talk publicly or do that, their son gave them a pass. Not only a pass, he gave them an order.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what you have to do. And, I remember reading one line in there about he didn't want a military burial, right? And I remember reading where he said, I'm paraphrasing here, Reid, but he said basically, if you have a military burial, I will haunt you.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, like that's like, okay, we're not doing that. That's what he wants.
Yes, sir.
But he gave them the path to do this, to remember him, to honor him. And, he gave them the path. And I feel like, you showed up with the SUV and said, get in the SUV and drive it down the path. I mean, that's an embarrassing analogy, but seriously, I mean, like, that's
but suicide is so complicated. There's so much stigma to it. There's so much shame with mental health in general. I think he had to give them that path if they would ever get to that. I remember that very first conversation when I'm sitting, not the phone conversation, but in person. One of his two brothers was there, along with his parents, his girlfriend, and a couple family friends. And it's just one of those mass interviews that is like, gets really confusing in your notes, but it was really powerful. But I remember his brother, especially. This is his older brother who played football at Mankato State University, same place as Adam Thielen. And he was really touchy about telling some of the details of his first suicide attempt in November and then in December when he followed through with it. And he's like, I don't want grandma and grandpa to hear this stuff. This would be embarrassing for them. And that was a big hang up for him throughout this process. He came around to recognizing that there's something bigger at play here. But his first instinct was, I don't want my family's dirty laundry put out there. Right. Brenda, especially, and Allie, his girlfriend, they, I think, understood that the whole point of this story is the dirty laundry. It's the messy stuff that he was going through as he was struggling with this brain disease that was partially, if not the majority, caused by playing football fearlessly or recklessly, however you want to say it.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the journals, the autobiography. I mean, the different. You were able to hear from him,
yeah,
without interviewing him, and I want to know. Tell me, Reid, what was that process like for you? Where did you digest those? How did you digest those? How did it make you feel as you went through and really, heard his voice for the first time?
Yeah, it was. It was kind of transcendent, to be honest. It was the moment that I was like, okay, like he left behind the goods, more or less. It made my job so much easier. I mean, forget made it easier as a journalist, made it possible. But I met them right at the beginning of January, and then at that point, I was mostly covering college basketball, and we had just moved up to Minneapolis, so it's not like I could just drive down there and say hi on a random Wednesday afternoon. So I told them, like, I'm going to be researching this. I'm going to be doing some phone interviews over the next few months, but I'm not going to be able to come down here until after the Final Four in April. And they agreed to it, and I came down there to do a whole bunch of interviews with a girlfriend, with a bunch of people for like 4 days, stayed on a friend's couch. Didn't have the expense account that I'd normally have on a work trip, but the family gave me, I think it was the first day I was down there, they gave me just this box filled with journals, and it also had his computer, his laptop computer, and they're just basically like, here you go. And I went to they secured a conference room for me at the small local college. I sat there for, it must have been 6 hours going through all these journals. And for the first hour or two, it was like a little bit disappointing because I get this journal. It's like his motivational journal, and it's talking about Tony Robbins' books and how, his 8 goals to be a better man. And it's, and then another journal is like his medical journal, and it has a bunch of medical records and some of his notes on it. Important, but like, I talked with editors at GQ, and they're like, what they wanted was that real human story of his decline. And then I specifically remember opening up this 5-star Mead journal with a black cover, opening it up, and it said on the top, June 2nd, 2015, in his chicken scratch handwriting, which, by the way, the title is that's a stylized version of Zach's handwriting from his suicide note. And in his handwriting, it said, hi, Mr. Journal. I decided I'm going to take this to document, my ups and downs, blah, blah, blah. I've never done this before, but here goes. And for pages and pages and pages, it's, this is the final 6 months of his life, starting in, early June, and he died in mid-December. And this journal was just like, it was remarkable because he'd talk about how he, it was his birthday and he went to have dinner with his parents, and he told them for the first time, I think I have this disease that Mike Webster had, CTE, and his dad kind of scoffs, and his mom's like, okay, we're going to fix it right away. And then, a week later, he talks about driving home from a doctor's appointment in Des Moines and getting lost, driving to his childhood home, a ride that he'd made thousands of times before. But then you'd also see these high moments where he's like, I'm going to kick this disease's ass. I'm going to do this. I'm going to apply for jobs, blah, blah, blah. And then the next journal entry, he'd just be in this depressive funk and talk about using a boatload of drugs over the weekend, and he's just losing hope. That handwritten journal, the 39-page autobiography type thing that I mentioned earlier, and then this boatload of text messages that Allie, his girlfriend, gave me. I mean, it must have been hundreds and hundreds of text messages between them during the final 2 months of his life. And man, kids these days, they text a lot. But it was like in real time, seeing his ups and his downs, his hopes and dreams, and then his depression and his struggles with this traumatic brain injury. That's what a concussion is. And those three sort of like primary sources are what makes this book, because it's like Zach speaking from beyond the grave.
For sure. It's fascinating to me, when we talk about kids these days, right, and the text they send, that he would sit down with a notebook and a pen and paper and handwrite what he was feeling is remarkable.
It is, because you think about, like, why wouldn't he just go put it on Twitter, right? Like, that's what we do these days.
Or open up his laptop and type into it, or, that's seriously old school, fascinating. I think it speaks to him as a person in some ways, like with sort of more of a, just more kind of old school in a way.
Yeah. He grew up in this very masculine world, one of the middle of three boys. Dad's the football coach and the hunter, grows up on the land, loves hunting, loves football. He's so tough. Like, this dude was just like, he didn't have the body to be an awesome football player. He was just a little bit small, but he had the mind, because he didn't care if he got hurt. That was it. It led to his demise. But he also had this side of him that was very in touch with his feelings. He was a mama's boy. He was very introspective, and I feel like that's sort of the surprising part of him, because you have this vision of this tough guy football player who may not even be aware that he has these sorts of feelings, these intimate feelings, and Zach very much did, even if he didn't go and talk to everybody about it.
One more question I want to ask you, and then I'd love for you to read and share some of the book with us. Reid, I'm curious. You mentioned earlier that his family was happy with the book, and you just said how introspective he was. I'm curious if you've given any thought to what he would think about what you've put together.
So much thought. I mean, for 5 years, I've kind of been, on and off thinking about that. A book like this, look, I'm excited to have my first book, right? Like, it's an ego boost. We're writers, we have egos, but this became, right from the beginning, like a journalistic duty, a calling of sorts, because this man will never take another breath again. And he has this remarkable story that says something about, not just about football and being football more safe, but something about being a man in America. So I'd love to talk with him, not to see if he liked the book. What you said earlier, does he think that I got him, that I understood him? I think I did, but there could be something in there where he's like, man, I didn't like football as much as my dad and my brothers did. I just said that. He has some, because there are, like, and I think that's probably the CTE talking, there are sort of some ups and downs when he talks about how much he loves football, and then he talks about how much he hates football and what it did to him. There's a lot of that sort of back and forth. So because I never really got to meet him, I never could ask him those questions that I'd like to ask. But I think someone said to me, even if you sell 25 copies of this book, this family will have something that, 150 years from now, this will still be on their bookshelf. And that was like, that kind of like hit me, or I was like, oh, this does carry on this young man's tragic legacy.
It does. And as much as your publisher and the fine folks at Anderson who really would like to sell a lot of books, this is a book that has a higher purpose in a way. To me, to be totally honest about it.
Well said.
Share with us please take a little bit of time here and share with us and read a little bit of the book for us.
Yeah, so I'm going to read the prologue. The prologue, I feel like I should give people a trigger warning of sorts. This is deep, dark, heavy stuff. This is Zach's first suicide attempt. This was in November of 2015, about 5 weeks before. I'm not spoiling any endings. You'll know in the first chapter that Zach died. But 5 weeks before he completed a suicide attempt. And yeah, I think this really gets right into it. Zach Easter stood on the long wooden dock leading out onto Lake Aquabi, gripping the .40 caliber pistol he'd given his dad for Father's Day, not even 5 months before. The sun had dipped over the horizon on the other side of the Y-shaped lake. Leaves lay in heaps on the fringe of the woods. The gusty November winds died down as the sun sank on the horizon, but there was still a chill in the air. Winter was coming. Zach took out his phone and snapped a picture. He posted it to Snapchat, ignoring the frantic phone calls that were pouring into his phone. God bless America, he captioned the photo. Where is Zach? All around Zach's hometown, friends and family were terrified. They'd seen his Facebook post a few minutes before. If you're reading this, then God bless the times we've had together. Please forgive me. I'm taking the selfish road out. Only God understands what I've been through. I will always watch over you. They needed to stop him. But how? They didn't even know where he was. From the house where Zach grew up, a few miles away and amidst fields of corn, his parents called. Zach did not pick up. From the small town just down the street where Zach had played high school football, and from Des Moines, the big capital city not quite 20 miles to the north, his friends called. Zach did not pick up. At 5:36 p.m., a college roommate texted him. Hey, what are you up to, bud? No reply. From the law school at Case Western Reserve University, almost 700 miles away in Cleveland, Ohio, Allie Epperson, Zach's girlfriend and the only person to whom he had fully confided his struggles with his rapidly deteriorating brain, called. Zach did not pick up. She called again. He did not pick up. She called again. Finally, Zach picked up. There was terror in his voice. I can't do this, he told her. It's never going to get better. Allie, a vivacious law student who in many ways was Zach's opposite, a bleeding heart liberal who balanced out Zach's dyed-in-the-wool conservatism, was freaking out. How many hours had she spent on the phone with him, talking about the disease that seemed to be eating his brain from the inside? How many times had the two talked about the sport he loved, the sport that had consumed much of his childhood, but now seemed to be consuming the rest of his life as well? How many times had she told him that a real man was not stoic and unfeeling, that a real man must face his demons instead of suffering silently in deference to some antiquated ideal of masculinity? How many times had she told him not to apologize to her, that she loved him despite the crazy stuff that was going on, and that they would work through it all together? Earlier on this day, Friday the 13th of all days in November 2015, he had apologized again. I'm sorry you fell in love with a guy with a ducked-up brain, Zach had texted her, his phone's autocorrect softening the swear word. He'd awoken early, started drinking, and called Allie in a panic late in the morning, shit-faced and swerving his car around the suburbs. She'd coaxed him to drive into a gas station, then into a Jimmy John's to grab a sandwich and sober up. She'd calmed him, like she always did. He'd apologized, like he always did. She'd texted him back. You can't choose who you fall in love with. You just fall in love. Then he texted an ominous reply. If anything happens to me, just by a chance of luck, tell my family everything. Now things were happening. A friend noticed the setting of Zach's Snapchat photo, the beach on Lake Aquabi, where Zach and Allie had escaped to in the summer to get away from high school friends and stare at the clouds. The lake was just down the road from his family's house. The lake's name is derived from an ancient Algonquian language. It means resting place. Allie kept Zach on the phone. Listen to the sound of my voice, she soothed him. Listen to the sound of my voice. I'm losing my mind, he cried. This is it for me. One Warren County Sheriff's Office cruiser came speeding down the winding hill toward the lake, followed by another. Allie, did you send these cops here? The cops got closer to him. He started apologizing to Allie, and he told her he wanted his brain donated for research. Then Zach's phone cut out. Out on the dock, Zach pointed the pistol at the darkened sky and fired a warning shot. That is when a pickup truck sped down the hill and slammed to a stop next to the lake. Zach's father, a burly former high school football coach named Miles Easter, jumped out. The parking lot quickly filled with squad cars. One deputy, a former all-conference linebacker who played for Miles on the same high school team Zach had played for, trained his assault rifle on Zach. Lasers from other police rifles danced on Zach's body. The evening was dark and it was getting cold. Miles saw the cherry red 2008 Mazda 3 Zach called Old Red. He peered into the window of his son's car. He saw an empty six-pack of Coors Light, an empty bottle of Captain Morgan rum, and a pill bottle. Floodlights illuminated Zach. A black curtain fell on the water behind him. Zach stood up from a picnic table and walked down the pier toward a wooden fishing hut at water's edge. A few more steps and he'd be inside, alone on the water, out of sight. "Put your gun down," the deputy shouted. "Nope," Zach yelled with an anguished laugh. "Not gonna do that." In a flash, Zach's father realized what was happening. Zach wants the police to shoot him. "Fuck it," Miles said to himself. "I can't let this happen." Zach's father sprinted past the sheriff's deputies and onto the pier. "Zach," he shouted. "If he shoots me, he shoots me," the father thought. "Dad, stop." As Miles Easter ran toward his son, Zach's face came into focus. His blue eyes looked foggy and confused. The expression on his still boyish face matched the tenor of his voice. Sad, sick, exhausted, scared, worn down by life, beaten once and for all. "Zach, I'm coming," Miles said. "Put your gun down." "Dad," Zach shouted. "Dad, stop." Then, gripping his father's pistol, Zach disappeared into the fishing hut. The door slammed shut behind him, and Zach Easter was alone.
I'm covered in chills.
It's tough to read every time.
I mean, wow, it's remarkable.
His parents, or at least his mom, was on a couple of the readings that I've done of that. And she told me leading up to the publication date that she was having nightmares about this. She sort of she wanted this book to come out with every fiber of her being, but she also dreaded it, probably because it makes her relive the worst moments of her life.
Yeah. I want to ask you a couple questions, bigger picture about football and about American sport, Reid. And while we talk about that, those of you who are here joining us, thanks so much for doing so. If you've got questions you want to ask, drop them in the chat, and we'll get to those real shortly. I think about the story of Zach and so many other young men who battle mental health issues and connected to head injuries, whether it's in football or other sport, Reid. And I think back to the first, when I was at ESPN and we did the first piece on Mike Webster in the early 2000s, and nobody really knew about all of this and what it meant. And so, there was the excuse back then of ignorance.
Yes.
You didn't know what you were getting into. As we sit here in 2020, that's no longer the case. People know what the potential dangers are of playing a sport like football. And yet, you go coast to coast in our country, and as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, and as old in the NFL as men in their 40s, still do this and accept those risks and do it anyway. I'm curious why you think that is.
I think the simple answer is we're addicted. I don't think, the word addiction, I think, has an insidious connotation to it. I'm not sure if us being addicted to football is always insidious. I myself love football, still do, have lots of moral issues with it, and I've spent a lot of time. There have been times where I thought I was sort of breaking up with football, but I've kind of landed on there are risks and there are rewards, and not just excitement on a Sunday afternoon rewards, but bringing together a community, helping raise from boys into young men, hopefully often in positive ways. I feel conflicted about football. I'll be the first to admit it. But I think you're right. Like, you bring up the idea of, like, back in when Mike Webster's story comes out, total ignorance about this from, everyone. It's not just blame the NFL, although there's a lot of blame that should go there. All of us, we didn't know. And I think that is, in a way, a blessing for Zach Easter's parents. He graduated from high school in 2010, which was really when this stuff was going from, like, a story here or a story there into, like, something that was really in the public eye. New York Times writing about it on the front page. Junior Seau comes about a few years later. I don't think his dad could move forward in life if he didn't have that explanation or excuse of, I didn't know. I knew I could hurt my shoulder, didn't know I could hurt a brain. Parents now are in a more difficult situation because we know we don't have the full picture of it. Science hasn't caught up. The phrase that I heard more than any other when I went to a brain conference at University of North Carolina for this book was the infancy of the science. Like, this isn't going to be solved next year. It's going to be solved 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Think of it like cancer in the 1950s. And I think that puts parents of, specifically parents of boys, because we're talking about football, but it's really about all contact sports, but especially football. Parents of boys, I think, are in a tricky spot because we know something is a little bit dangerous there. We're paying attention to it. But it's not like we have sideline saliva tests where you can say without a doubt, this guy was concussed, he's out of this game, and he goes straight into protocol. It's a lot of guesswork right now. So I think parents are in a really tricky spot.
And I think we are also in a society where that won't happen to me. I mean, we do that now with the virus, right? No, 100%. Like, that's somebody else's problem. I'm not going to get the virus. I'm not going to have the CT problem until the police officer knocks on your front door and it's been your kid.
Yeah.
So one other thing that, you mentioned in the book, and then we'll get to a couple of the questions we have. You propose this very large question. I guess it's kind of similar to what we talked about. And look, I ask you this question with a legendary Iowa football coach over one shoulder and a Chicago Bears helmet signed by 3 linebackers over another. But you propose the question, is football worth it? And I want to know what you think.
So the context of me is I did not play football growing up, other just in the backyard. But I grew up a pretty big football fan. Grew up in Pittsburgh as a Cleveland Browns fan. Tell me one
That's not easy.
fan decision than that one. There aren't any, by the way. There are not any. But I think you can tell from the tone of the book, because look, what I hope this book is not an anti-football book. It's not a pro-football book. It's not a love letter to the sport, but it's not a book that says football needs to go away. Bennett Omalu, I think, is a bit of a activist on football. And I don't share his view that, you have to be 18 years old to play the sport of football because that's the age of consent. That's when you're allowed to smoke cigarettes, another thing that can do damage to your body that some people thoroughly enjoy. But where I land on is football, I think, is worth it because of an example of a person who I know, who I was going to insert in this book, but it just didn't quite work out. Division III quarterback, won a national championship, didn't play in the NFL, but had this incredible career. And I was talking with him a few years ago, grabbed lunch with him, and I was asking about concussions and CTEs. He's like, oh, I had so many. He's telling me all these stories, war stories. You still kind of laugh about them because it's I was wobbling all around. I don't remember the second half, even though you think about that and you're like, oh my God, that's terrifying. But he's like, I have memory issues. I have all these struggles. He told me that he thought he would end up dying by suicide. And he still loves football and doesn't regret 1 minute of playing it because it made him the man that he is today. And he talks about his coach, his college coach, being the single most important, outside of his father, the single most important male role model in his life. by the way, his coach is one of the visionaries in, John Gallardi, the St. John's University coach. He was not just a great Division III football coach, but a guy who did a bunch of practices where they had low contact practices, shorter practices, very much like the way that football is moving. I think football is worth it ultimately, but if science in 20 years, what I'm most scared of is that science will look at subconcussive hits. Like, you can take the concussions out of the game. Subconcussive hits where linemen, hit heads 60 times a game against each other. That's the scariest part, because you can't take that out of the game. And that becomes the end of football in a couple generations. If science says, we can draw a line that, like, if you play football for X amount of years, you have X% chance, even if you don't have big concussions, you have X% chance of developing a brain disease by age 60. If science can say that, I think that's when football goes away. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we figure this out, because I do love football. And I think there's a lot of good that comes from it.
I agree. Totally agree. We've got some questions here. And I appreciate everybody for joining us. And now we're going to interact a little bit. Reid, the first question here comes from Ashley. She says, you mentioned being a father of 2 boys. I'm curious if covering the story has affected how you parent sports and sport culture to your boys.
Yeah. So my wife and I have talked a lot about will our kids, if they want to, play football? And we land on no, which makes me a hypocrite, because I'm downstairs on Sundays watching the Vikings with my 4-year-old son. At least I was last year when they seemed like a decent team. Not so much this year. But like, it's a different question when he's 4 and we're talking about in this theoretical. What happens when he's 14 and loves football because he's been watching with his dad for a decade, and all his friends are going out for the high school team, and he turns into a good athlete. Apparently he's adopted in this scenario. And he's like, all my friends are doing this, Dad. We've been watching this. I want to do this. I think it becomes a much more difficult question then. But I have been thinking more about masculinity, and this is a subtle thing, but I used to say to ever since he was a little kid, to my now 8-year-old son, his name's Owen, I used to say when he was in trouble or if he was crying about something, I wanted to, like, get his attention. I'd be like, look me in my eyes like you're a man. And I look at that now and I'm like, it's silly. Like, that I'm trying to put having eye contact with someone that's a masculine trait, So I want my kids to be strong and tough to an extent, and like that traditional masculine virtues, I guess. But I also want to frame it around, like, this is good human virtues, not just good man virtues. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Makes absolute sense. Absolutely, that makes sense. The next question here comes from Denise. Reid, she'd like to know, were there any other authors also interested in getting the story? If so, why do you think the family chose you?
You know what? There was a talented newspaper reporter with the Des Moines Register who I used to work with and friends with, and he was sort of chasing the story at the same time. And I did a little bit of haranguing of the family to be like, let's not go big with another outlet. But I think, and I'm not, GQ probably, if they had done something in the Des Moines Register, I'm not sure if that would stop GQ from doing a story. But I was worried about it. They did talk to other people and other journalists, and there were stories about him. Nothing as in depth as this magazine article. But I think the key was that I mean, he's not some famous guy that there were going to be people knocking down his door to write his tragic story. But I do think the key was that I was there. I was there at the beginning, and I bonded with them that very first time, 2 weeks after their son died, and just, talk to them very frankly about the process. And I think that's, especially for people, like if I'm going to interview, a 15-minute interview with Karl Anthony Towns of the Minnesota Timberwolves, I don't have to explain to him the ground rules and how this thing works. With families that aren't written about, I always do. And I'm like, look, if there's something that you don't want in the story, we can talk about it. Say off the record, if you just kind of like those very easy explainers. And I think that can help bond you with sources, I guess.
And I would think too, I mean, you're relatable to them. You have lived in the Midwest. You're not flying in from, Manhattan
Right.
and trying to sort of, I don't know, woo this, small town Iowa family in a way that just wouldn't work with them.
Yeah. No, it's totally true. And I think the idea of like having a person who sort of vouched for me, like a semi-source, and I could say, I think that stuff is huge.
Reid Frank wants to know, he says, congrats on the book. I've been following your great work from Fox Sports and CBS and Laurels and Lemons. Any blowback from the NFL or organized football in general?
This is a high school friend. If he knows Laurels and Lemons, that was from the high school newspaper. I believe it was called the North Star in North Allegheny High School, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Nice.
I did that was where I really did my best work, to be honest. I haven't gotten blowback, at least not yet. I attempted. This book's about football, but it's really a story about a young man. I went to this conference, this brain conference, and at this brain conference, Dr. Alan Sills, who is the head of, it's like basically the head doctor for the NFL, really illustrious surgeon, not like the people that they had originally trotted out to be like sort of when they were in that age of denial about concussions in football. He's a respected doctor. And I saw him speak and I talked to him and he made me go through their PR folks and they did not connect me with him. But I didn't hound them. Sometimes things like that, you got to email 6 or 7 times. I was just like, I don't know if I need it. But no, I haven't gotten blowback because I do think, and I think, look, NFL doesn't want a book like this out. They don't want a book that says concussions and football and, young men. But I think if this book makes any sort of waves, and if they read this book, they'll see it for what it is, which is, I think this book is nuanced. And I don't think we do nuance particularly well in America. I think there's one line in here that I think is, not to see the guy's going to read his own words again, but like toward the end of the book, I tried to describe how we as America feel about football. And here's what I came up with. Football is awful, a sport that brings out the very worst violent tendencies in the human species and that destroys us in the process. Football is great, the one true sport, teaching us how to deal with physical pain without being utterly defeated by it, while forging the true American male. Football is a dangerous, vile sport. Football is a beautiful, cathartic sport. Football, perhaps, is both. I think like I didn't set out to write a polemic against football. And I think that's where the complexity lies. So I'm really curious if in a year, if I'm saying the same thing, that there hasn't been much blowback from football to NFL or stuff like that.
I think like any good story read lives in the gray area.
Yeah, for sure.
And where we are, I mean, honestly, in media now is black and white.
Yeah.
And you pick your side and you're as loud and obnoxious as possible and you get the eyeballs and the fatter paycheck. So you're absolutely right where living in gray, living in nuance isn't done well anymore. Another thing that I thought about is, because you have, as we discussed, Zach speaking to us, through your words, being critical of the messages, being critical of a young man who's no longer here.
Yeah.
And that's a heck of a lot harder to do than to criticize a writer.
I think the NFL, and that's a great point. And if you look at someone like Brenda Easter, his mom, who's sort of like become the activist, she now hates football and she doesn't want it to go away, but she wants some pretty, no tackle football until age 14, and her grandkids are never going to play football. But I forgot where I was going with that. I totally lost my train of thought.
We were just talking about how it's harder to go after Zach.
Yeah. Brenda Easter's kind of like a gold star mom. It's like someone in the military that loses their kid to war, and I think that's why people got so up in arms when Trump attacked the one Gold Star mom. I think it was at the convention in 2016, maybe. Because those people are supposed to be untouchable, right? They suffered the most unimaginable pain, and I think you're right. Like the fact that, and this kind of, I can see that one more question about whether his parents and doctors truly think that his issues were CTE, and one, the fact that this has all his words in this, and two, the fact that he has a brain report that his family has a brain report that they sent me that came back that he tested positive for. I think it's like stage 2 of CTE. This is CTE is not like a broken arm, right? Like it's complex and it's new and we're still learning about it. But I think being able to have those two things, Zach's words, and then like here's science. Here's what science says. Zach blames it on concussions, mostly from football, and science says, yep. His brain was messed up. I think you're right. It makes it a lot more difficult to just attack the writer, attack the journalist.
Awesome. Well, listen, we really appreciate everybody joining us. It's been awesome to chat with you, Reid. I hope everybody goes out and just divulges love Zach, because it's fantastic work. And thanks for everything. Jenny, anything else you want to add here tonight?
I would just add to our thanks from the bookstore for your time, those of you who joined us, and to Reid and Wayne for taking the time to be with our store specifically. We really, really appreciate that. I think a lot of good can come from this conversation, this book, the sharing of this story. Reid, I think, society really has a thanks to you for sharing this. We need to look at these hard things and we need to talk about them. And I think these conversations are really, really important. So I know there are folks in the room, in the Zoom room with us tonight who have been affected by suicide. And I think it's important that we talk about those things. So I would add my thanks. I would let everybody attending know that if you did order a book, that those are, I have signed book plates, I think, from Reid, and those are going to be available starting tomorrow, or we will start shipping those out tomorrow. So you'll get those that way. If anybody is interested in purchasing a copy of the book, if you didn't already, I am going to put the link back up to the book in the chat right there, so that you can go ahead and order your copy. We'll ship all over the country and hopefully get some more thoughtful things going on, thanks to Reid's story here and Zach's story, and Wayne, your help in that is appreciated as well. So that's what I got.
Great. Awesome. Jenny, thanks for having us, and Wayne,
absolutely,
thanks for doing this, man.
Awesome.
Appreciate it so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all. All right, be safe out there, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye all.